Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. And if other people join, that's great. This is being recorded, so if you need to refer back to something later on, you should be able to. I'll send out the recording later. So this webinar is about applying for a variance from BMZA in Baltimore City. My name is Becky Witt. I'm the executive director of BMZA. And we are kind of a small agency with 5 staff members and 5 board members and a couple of alternates. So all the things I'm going to be talking about today are general information for your benefit as you kind of prepare for your hearing. It's intended for people who are applying for a variance coming up. But I can't say for sure how the board is going to rule on any particular issue. So I can kind of give information, but I can't give advice, and I can't predict necessarily how the board will rule because it's up to them to decide. So with that being said, let's get started. Variances are exceptions from the rules in the zoning code. So you can get a variance to things like bulk and yard regulations, which we'll talk about in a second, off-street parking and loading, and some kinds of sign regulation. There are specific things in the code that it says you can get a variance to, and then there's some other things that it's not really clear. So it may vary a lot depending on your case, but we will tell you if the code says you can't get a variance to what you're asking for. It's really important to know that variances, generally speaking, are supposed to be rare, meaning that and these are just a few little quotes from different cases in Maryland law. The first one says, a variance permits an action which is prohibited and presumed to be in conflict with the ordinance. So we have to presume that the variance should not be approved. The presumption goes against the applicant. There's another case that says that variances are rarely appropriate. And that the authority to grant a variance should be exercised sparingly and only under exceptional circumstances. So variances are really not something that are supposed to be given out a lot of. They're supposed to be for very specific circumstances, which we'll talk about in a second. It's just really important to know that from the beginning for context. So here are what are called the bulk and yard regulations. These are in the tables that are found at the very end of the zoning code. And at the end, I will try to remember to show you where you can find the actual text of the zoning code, so you can look this up yourself. So these are all the different tables where they're found. And most of what we see are from the residential and commercial tables, which I can get into in a little more detail if necessary. So here are the kinds of things that are found in these tables. Things like the lot area, which means the square footage of the lot. So this is just a random example that I found on the internet. It's not relating to any property in Baltimore City, but in this case, we would multiply 110 by 77.63 to find the lot area. And there are regulations about how large a lot needs to be for different kinds of uses. The height of a building, the lot coverage of a building. So that talks about how much of the lot your building can take up. Impervious surface means anything that rainwater cannot penetrate through. So things like physical structures, but also things like driveways and sidewalks, and even decks and other things like that. Front yard, side yard, and rear yard. In all these different zoning districts, there are different regulations that say how large your front yard is required to be, if you're even required to have one, side yard, rear yard. So basically every single dimension of a lot or a structure is covered under the bulk and yard regulations. Sorry if there's background noise. You can also possibly get a variance to off-street parking and loading. So these are the tables that have the off-street parking regulations for car parking and then for bicycle parking, and as well the regulations for off-street loading, which comes up in the commercial and industrial zoning districts. And then sign regulations. So generally speaking, we see variance requests for the size of signs. There's all these regulations depending on what zoning district you're in of how large your sign can be, where it can be on the building, and generally the number of signs. We're not allowed to give variances from the number of signs. So if the code says you can have one sign, you can apply for a variance for more than one sign, but we're not going to be able to grant it. So that's an example of something that we can't grant a variance from. So those are the kinds of things that you can apply for a variance from in the zoning code. And here we're going to start to talk a little bit more about the approval standards, meaning how does the board decide whether or not to grant a variance? And I know this is probably pretty small. This is the section of the code that it comes from, 5308. And we're just going to be talking about a couple of parts of this section of the code. So it's actually kind of swapped. The one that we spend a lot of time, that's kind of the threshold question, is that whether or not there is something unique about the property for which the variance is sought, and whether that unique factor, whatever it is, or maybe it's more than one thing, because of that thing, it creates a practical difficulty in complying with the code. So we'll get into it a little bit more. Let's just, like I just said, there's kind of a two-part test for a variance: uniqueness and practical difficulty. So when you come to a zoning board hearing, you will hear us talk over and over and over again for all the variance cases about what is the uniqueness of the property and what is the practical difficulty in complying with the code. That's what we spend 95% of the time talking about. So here are some examples of some unique conditions that might be true about your property. Things like physical surroundings of the property, such as access to nearby streets and alleys, just for example. The size and the shape of the lot itself. This can be difficult in a place like Baltimore City, where we have lots and lots of row house lots the lots are basically identical to each other. But we do get some irregular lots. Maybe it's a weird triangular shape at the end of a bunch of row houses, or maybe it could just be some other kind of size and shape that's unique. That means that it's difficult for you to build something on this lot because of how small it is, or because it's triangular instead of rectangular, or something like that. Topographical conditions is one that comes up quite a bit, especially when you are measuring height of a building. So if there's a significant slope to your property, it might be difficult to meet the bulk and yard regulations in some way. Or maybe the significant slope means that a big portion of your lot is not buildable. And so you have to build on a smaller portion of the lot, which means that you need to get a little bit closer to the side yard, or for something like that. Occasionally we see something about subsurface conditions, things like underground streams, stormwater management. Environmental factors could be an issue. I know that's come up a few times before, where a portion of the lot is contaminated and you can't build on it, or it needs to be capped or something, and so you have to build on a smaller portion of the lot, which means that you're a little too close to one of the lot lines. Historical significance could also be a factor here. Other kinds of restrictions imposed by abutting properties, unusual architectural aspects. Those are some examples of some unique conditions that might be present that might be the basis for a variance. And there could be some unique conditions that are not listed here. These are just examples. And it could be that maybe more than one unique condition is true, and the way that they interact with each other means that you need a variance. So let's say your lot is a little bit smaller and there's a paper alley next to it, and that creates some sort of issue with the development of the property. So it could be more than one, certainly. But there does have to be something unique about your specific property. The uniqueness has to be related to the physical property itself, whether that's the lot or the structure or both. it cannot relate to the people who are using the property. So sometimes we have people come in and say, well, I need to build an addition because I have a large family and we just had another child and we need, another bedroom or something like that. Um, and so that's unique because of our situation. But that is not related to the property itself. That's related to the people using the property. And so that for zoning purposes, the uniqueness cannot relate to the human beings that are using the premises. If someone in your household has a disability that's federally recognized, you might be able to qualify for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. For something like a ramp or for something like um, making your house more accessible to someone in a wheelchair. Um, and that might require you to get exceptions from these setbacks. But the BMZA cannot grant a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. So you would have to get that from the zoning administrator. And if that is your situation, I'd be happy to send you the link to the form to fill out to ask for a reasonable accommodation. But that's not something that the BMZA can grant as a variance. So it's just a different process. So again, the uniqueness has to be related to the physical property in some way. Another thing about uniqueness is, and a lot of times people come in and say, well, a lot of other people in my neighborhood already have this thing that I want, and so I should get it too. And that is not in and of itself a um, a basis for a variance. Other people already having something like a front yard parking pad or a rear yard shed or an addition that looks similar to what you want, that is not a uniqueness that leads to a practical difficulty in your case. You still have to prove that your property is unique. Those other properties might be non-conforming or something like that. And so just in and of itself, the fact that other people have something that you want does not qualify for uniqueness. All right, so that's what I have to say on uniqueness. For those of you who have joined and you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I will try to get to them as I move through here. All right, so let's go on to practical difficulty. So the second part of the test is that the applicant has to prove that the uniqueness that we've established has led to a disproportionate negative impact on you that creates a practical difficulty in complying with the code. So that's kind of a mouthful. We have to kind of connect the uniqueness to why you can't comply with the code, with the setbacks, for example, why you can't comply with the off-street parking requirements. So that can be tricky because anyone can find, even for a row house property, you can find something unique about it, right? Maybe it's painted an interesting color, or maybe it's an inch taller than its neighbor, right? But that uniqueness is probably not related to a practical difficulty in complying with the code. So that is what's really important. You have to create that connection between the two things. So, before I get to that, for example, if you have an unusually small lot, um, that might mean that you might need a side yard variance because you can't fit a reasonably sized house onto this extra small lot. So that's kind of the classic example of an unusual size or shape of the property leading directly to a practical difficulty in complying with the setback requirements. That's kind of the classic example. All right, so a really important thing to know as well is that self-inflicted hardship cannot be a proper grounds for a variance. So we have a couple cases coming through in the next few months where someone started building an addition or they built a deck or something without a permit. And they got issued a citation from the city saying you need a permit for this, and then they went to get the permit and the permits office said you need a variance. Well, just because you've built something without a permit doesn't mean that that's a practical difficulty or a uniqueness that will get you a variance. If you have caused the issue, then you can't then go ahead and use that to apply for a variance. So that's really important to know. And we've had some cases where a contractor has made a mistake, has maybe poured a foundation incorrectly, and then they've come back later and tried to get a variance, but they didn't have any argument to make based on uniqueness or practical difficulty, just that their contractor made a big mistake and poured the foundation of the house incorrectly, and that we could not approve a variance in that case because the hardship was self-inflicted. As well, there's been a couple of cases where a city official has issued a permit in error, made a mistake and issued the permit, and then later realized that the person needed a variance to build what they were going to build. And that is also not in and of itself a uniqueness or practical difficulty if the city accidentally issues you a permit when you really needed a variance the whole time. So those cases can get a little tricky later. So please make sure that when you're coming up with your project that you know whether or not you need a variance. Okay, there's some other inadequate justifications for a variance in and of itself. And this is, if this is your only basis for a variance, this is not an adequate justification. It could be nice to have on top of your argument about uniqueness and practical difficulty, but just by itself, it's not adequate. So things like community support, city council member support, those things are nice to have, but they're not a substitute for an argument that shows uniqueness and practical difficulty. Property owner or homebuyer preferences, so adding a bedroom, a larger kitchen, that is not a good enough justification for a variance. Convenience, a better layout, aesthetic preferences, the desire to increase the value of the property, and the thing that I mentioned earlier, the idea that other properties in the neighborhood already have the thing that you want, that is also not a justification for a variance. So I think a lot of people, when we talk to them about variances and how high the standard is, say, well, my house is a row house and my house is basically the same as everybody else's house on the block, and there's not really anything I can point to that's unique about it. And so what do I do, basically? The answer really is that if you don't qualify for a variance, then you need to talk to your city council person about these bulk and yard regulations and whether they are reasonable in protecting the public health, safety, and welfare. These regulations can be changed at any time via city council ordinance. The regulations themselves. The variance standard, on the other hand, is pretty strict, and we can't loosen it without changing state law. So it's not that we can't change the variance standard to be something that's a little bit more generous, but we would probably need to talk to our state representatives about changing the variance standard that's in state law so that then the city council could change its variance standard to match. And then there's just a couple of quotes from cases that say that basically if the zoning code is being too restrictive and it's not letting people do things that seem perfectly reasonable, then the code needs to be changed. The zoning ordinance itself needs to be changed. So before I ask about if there's any questions, I wanted to really quickly show a couple of examples of, you guys probably know since you're upcoming applicants for variances, you've already seen the statement of justification that we require you to fill out. I wanted to show a couple of examples just that I thought would be helpful. Hold on one second. I'm going to reshare my screen as I open them. All right, and this is not to, I redacted all of the information about which property it is, which appeal it is. So I'm not trying to call anyone out. But it's just a couple of examples that I wanted to show. So here's an example of a statement of justification for a case that's coming up. And on the statement, it says, they describe the variance that they want, the rear yard variance. And then this is why we ask this in the statement of justification, right? We ask for what's unique about your property. And maybe when you filled this out, you were confused about why are we asking about what's unique about the property. This is why we ask, because the variance standard requires us to find something unique about your property. So if we say what's unique about these conditions, and you say there's nothing unique, then at the hearing, it's probably not gonna go your way because we have to find uniqueness first. So then in this example, it says, how would this lead to a hardship or practical difficulty? Basically, this person says, we've just already paid for these sets of drawings, and so we want a variance. That is not in and of itself good enough for the board to find that there's a variance that's needed here. Let me show another example really quickly. Oops. That's not what I meant to do. Sorry. There we go. All right, so here's another example that we got for a request for a rear yard setback variance and a lot coverage variance. And this statement of justification talks about some subsurface conditions. So the subject property was built on what used to be a stream bed, which creates a unique situation due to topographical conditions, physical surroundings, and past site work that altered or removed the underground stream. And then it talks a little bit more about removing the former stream bed, backfilling, diminishing the ability to improve this particular property. Now, the board will probably have questions and want to look at the site plan and see a little bit more details about what are the soil conditions, what does it mean, where was the former stream bed, what does the backfilling mean? They'll probably have some more questions about that, but this is a good beginning point to a variance request that the board might want to hear more about at the hearing. So I hope that those examples are helpful. That's why we asked for the statement of justification, so that when we get to the hearing, we can kind of move quickly through, look at your uniqueness, look at your practical difficulty, and then hopefully approve your request if it satisfies the conditions that are in the code. If you have any questions, like I said, please put them in the chat. Otherwise, I will send maybe some links afterwards that you can take a look at. This is our website, which I'm sure you've visited before. If you want to look up the zoning code itself, which is a little bit long and sometimes difficult to parse, it's 600 pages long. I like to go over here on the left-hand side and go through the different sections. If you want to go to the tables that show you all the different bulk and yard regulations, that's all the way down at the very bottom where it says zoning tables, and then you pull those up. For most of our cases, I would say they are in table 9401, this table here, that talks about the bulk and yard regulations for row house residential districts. But your property might be in a different district, like a commercial or industrial district, and so you'd have to pull up the correct table for that zoning district category. Let me see if there's anything else. Another helpful tab on our site, and the city is going to go through a total website redesign fairly soon, so I'll probably have to redo this video. But under application completeness, there's a couple helpful things. The completeness checklist, which you probably your case is probably already complete if you're watching this video, but it includes details on the site plans and floor plans and the written statement that are required to schedule your appeal. Also, the approval standards. So these are the actual handouts that the board has right in front of them as they're deciding your case. So this one is the one for variances. And you can see here, the first question talks about uniqueness. Are the conditions on which the application is based unique to the property? And because of those conditions, would there be a unnecessary hardship or practical difficulty? So this is what the board looks at as they're making their determination on your case. So you might want to take a look at this handout, which, like I said, is on our website, and make sure that you're prepared for your hearing. Okay, I don't think I have seen any um, questions pop up in the chat, but so I'll probably leave it there, but feel free always to reach out. I will put my email address in here. You probably got the invitation from me, so you probably already have my email address, but feel free to reach out if you have questions, and I will direct it to the right person if need be. So yeah, I will leave it at that. Thanks so much for joining, and see you at the hearing. Okay, bye.